Tyler Hensley was the kind of son every parent feared they might raise arrogant, ungrateful, and angry at a world that had given him everything. His mother, Margaret Hensley, spent years defending him from gossip and excuses, believing that love could fix what life had broken. But in the quiet town of Maplewood, that belief would cost her everything. What started as another argument between mother and son would end in a disappearance that left an entire community questioning how well they really knew the people living right next door. The Hensley family lived in the quiet, tree-lined town of Maplewood, the kind of place where everyone waved hello and gossip traveled faster than the morning mail. Their home sat at the end of Willow Drive, with a spotless white fence and a lawn trimmed so neatly it looked like a magazine cover. To most of their neighbors, the Hensleys were the picture of a stable, loving family. Mrs. Hensley, a nurse at the local clinic, was known for her warm smile and her habit of baking cookies for anyone who needed cheering up. She was polite, dependable, and seemed to have endless patience. Her son, Tyler, however, was a different story altogether. Tyler had always been a difficult child. Even when he was young, he had a way of testing limits, talking back to teachers, ignoring chores, and lying about the smallest things. At first, everyone thought he was just strong-willed, the kind of boy who'd grow out of it. But as the years passed, his behavior only grew worse. He started skipping school, sneaking out at night, and spending time with older kids who had no jobs and too much free time. His mother tried everything: therapy sessions, grounding him, even sending him to live with his aunt for a few months, but nothing worked. What made it harder was how well Tyler could play the part of the good kid when he wanted to. Around other adults, he could turn on the charm with practiced ease. Teachers often described him as smart but lazy, while neighbors said he seemed polite if a little distant. But behind closed doors, he was cold and cruel. He spoke to his mother with open disrespect, calling her names, mocking her, and blaming her for every problem in his life. Whenever she asked him to help with something as small as taking out the trash, he'd roll his eyes and storm off. Mrs. Hensley's husband had passed away when Tyler was just 12, and since then, she'd tried to fill both parental roles. She worked long shifts at the clinic, sometimes double shifts, just to keep the bills paid and the house maintained. Yet, no matter how hard she worked, Tyler seemed to resent her for it. He claimed she cared more about strangers than her own son. The truth was that she cared deeply about him so much that she ignored every warning sign, every red flag that told her he wasn't just troubled. He was dangerous in ways she didn't yet understand. As Tyler got older, the distance between mother and son grew into a canyon. He began bringing people home late at night, loud music blaring from his room. Neighbors could hear the shouting through the thin suburban walls, arguments that started small and ended with doors slamming hard enough to shake the windows. Once, a neighbor named Mrs. Cooper saw Mrs. Hensley standing outside on the porch at midnight, arms folded, staring into the dark yard with a look of pure exhaustion. When asked if everything was all right, she'd only smiled weakly and said, "Teenagers, you know how they are." Tyler's attitude changed completely when he turned 16 and got his first car, a shiny red one that his mother had saved up for months to buy. Instead of appreciation, he treated it like something he deserved all along. Soon, he was skipping more school days, driving out of town without permission, and posting pictures online of parties and bonfires with people no one in Maplewood recognized. Some of his so-called friends were older men in their 20s, some rumored to have criminal records. When Mrs. Hensley confronted him about it, he sneered and told her to stay out of his business. Still, she refused to give up on him. She told herself that he was just lost, that he would eventually grow out of his rebellious phase. She couldn't bring herself to believe that her only son was slipping into something darker than simple teenage defiance. She didn't see the growing anger in his eyes, or maybe she chose not to. Even as small valuables started disappearing from the house, her late husband's watch, some cash from her purse, she convinced herself it had just been misplaced. By the time Tyler turned 18, he rarely came home at all. When he did, the house filled with tension. He'd crash on the couch, eat whatever was in the fridge, and leave again without saying a word. He no longer called her Mom. He referred to her by her first name, like she was a stranger. Mrs. Hensley often told herself it was just his way of pushing boundaries, but there was something colder beneath it. The neighbors began whispering. They noticed how tired Mrs. Hensley looked, how she'd begun locking her doors even during the day, something she'd never done before. They saw how Tyler's friends would park their loud, dented cars in the driveway at odd hours, staying only long enough for quick exchanges. Some suspected drugs, others theft, but no one wanted to get involved. After all, it wasn't their business. And yet, there was a sense that something was building, something tense and unseen. The perfect family image of the Hensleys had started to crack, and the cheerful white house at the end of Willow Drive no longer looked so warm. Behind those walls, resentment was growing, resentment that would soon turn into something far more dangerous. In Maplewood, everyone believed they knew their neighbors, but in truth, no one really knew what was happening inside that house, or how much longer Mrs. Hensley could keep pretending that everything was fine. It was a chilly October morning when Maplewood woke up to a strange silence. The sun had barely risen, and the light fog hung low over the town like a curtain hiding something unsettling. On Willow Drive, the Hensley house looked the same as it always had, neat, tidy, calm. But inside, something was very wrong. Mrs. Hensley was nowhere to be found. Her bed was untouched, the coffee pot was clean, and her car still sat in the driveway. It was as if she had simply vanished in the middle of the night. The first person to notice her absence was her co-worker at the clinic. Mrs. Hensley never missed work. She was known for showing up early, staying late, and never failing to call if she was running behind. When she didn't show up for her morning shift, her friend tried calling her cell phone. No answer. By noon, she'd left 3 voicemails and sent 2 texts. Still nothing. That's when worrying started to spread. By the next morning, the police were knocking on the Hensleys' front door. Tyler answered, wearing a faded hoodie and an expression that could best be described as annoyance. He told the officers that his mother sometimes went off for a few days when she needed a break. He said she'd probably gone to stay with her sister in the next town over. The officers checked and found that Mrs. Hensley's sister hadn't heard from her in weeks. The story didn't add up. Inside the house, everything seemed perfect still. The living room looked frozen in time, with a cup of tea sitting cold on the coffee table and a half-folded blanket draped across the couch. On the kitchen counter, her purse sat open, her wallet inside, and her keys hanging on the hook by the door. It didn't look like she had gone anywhere voluntarily. Then one of the officers noticed something near the back door, a chair knocked over and a framed photo of Tyler and his mother lying face down, the glass shattered. It could have been nothing, but to them it felt like a sign of struggle. Word of the disappearance spread through Maplewood like wildfire. Neighbors gathered in small groups, whispering theories over coffee. Some said she might have had a breakdown. Others weren't so sure. A few even admitted they'd heard shouting coming from the Hensley house the night before she disappeared. The sound of a door slamming, maybe even something heavy hitting the floor, but nobody had called the police. They'd all told themselves it was just another mother-son argument, nothing serious. The following days were filled with search parties combing through the nearby woods and volunteers posting flyers on telephone poles. Tyler didn't participate. Instead, he spent most of his time locked in the house or driving around town. When questioned again, he repeated the same story, insisting his mother had left on her own. His voice was flat, emotionless. There was no panic, no concern, only irritation that people kept asking questions. Detectives began to look closer at his behavior. They noticed how calm he was, how he seemed more focused on checking his phone than talking about his missing mother. They found it odd that he hadn't filed a missing persons report himself. When asked why, he shrugged and said he figured she'd come back eventually. As the search continued, strange details began to emerge. One neighbor said she saw a faint orange glow coming from the Hensleys' backyard around midnight the night before Mrs. Hensley went missing. Another recalled hearing what sounded like a car trunk closing, followed by footsteps on the gravel driveway. None of it was enough to prove anything, but the stories painted a picture that was hard to ignore. Inside the police station, investigators pored over Mrs. Hensley's phone records and financial activity. Her bank account hadn't been touched, and her phone had been turned off at 11:47 p.m. that night. It pinged one last time near the edge of the woods behind Willow Drive before going dark. That single clue suggested she hadn't gone far. Meanwhile, Tyler started acting differently. He spent more time away from home, sometimes disappearing for days. He posted pictures online of himself hanging out with friends, smiling like nothing had happened. It made people uncomfortable. The town that had once pitied him began to see him differently. Parents told their kids to stay away from him. Old friends stopped answering his calls. Back at the house, detectives began to notice smaller things that didn't sit right. Cleaning supplies that looked recently used but were neatly put away, the faint smell of bleach in the air, and a patch of carpet near the kitchen that seemed newer than the rest. When asked about it, Tyler said he'd spilled juice and replaced it. The answer sounded too rehearsed. Days turned into weeks, and hope began to fade. Without a body or solid evidence, the case started to cool. Mrs. Hensley's face still hung on missing posters around town, her kind smile slowly fading in the weather. People began to talk less about her, though every now and then someone would lower their voice and ask if the police had found anything new. But even as the official search slowed, the air in Maplewood felt different. Something dark lingered beneath the calm surface. Everyone could feel it. The cheerful image of the Hensley family had shattered completely, leaving only questions and rumors behind. And though no one dared say it aloud, many suspected the same thing, that the person responsible for Mrs. Hensley's disappearance was the one who had lived under her roof all along. 2 weeks after Mrs. Hensley vanished, Maplewood began to settle into uneasy silence. The search parties had stopped, the flyers had started to curl at the edges, and the police updates became fewer and more vague. Yet the town's curiosity never faded. Everyone still wondered what had really happened on that quiet street at the edge of town. It was around that time that a hiker stumbled upon something strange in the woods. He'd been walking his usual trail about 3 miles from Willow Drive when something shiny caught his eye beneath a pile of fallen leaves. It was a small metal clasp, half buried in the dirt. As he brushed the leaves away, he found a partially burned purse, the leather melted and the contents scorched. Inside was a wallet with a driver's license. The name printed on it made his stomach drop. Margaret Hensley. Within hours, the woods were crawling with police. They cordoned off the area, combing through every inch of ground nearby. About 20 feet from where the purse was found, an officer uncovered a scrap of fabric tangled in the underbrush. It was part of a blue sweater, the same color Mrs. Hensley had been wearing in the last photo taken of her. The evidence was small, but it reignited the investigation that had nearly gone cold. When detectives arrived at the Hensley home later that day, Tyler opened the door with an expression of irritation rather than surprise. They told him about the discovery, watching closely for any reaction. He barely blinked. He said he had no idea how his mother's purse ended up there. He repeated his old story that she'd left on her own, and if her things were in the woods, maybe she'd dropped them before leaving town. His tone was flat, almost rehearsed, and his eyes stayed fixed on the floor. But something about the conversation bothered the detectives. When asked where he'd been on the night of his mother's disappearance, Tyler hesitated. He said he'd been home watching TV, but his story didn't match what the neighbors had said. One neighbor remembered seeing Tyler's car pulling out of the driveway late that night. Another heard footsteps outside around midnight. Along with the faint sound of something heavy being dragged, the detectives took note. They started looking deeper into his phone records. What they found was hard to ignore. His phone had been active in the area where the purse was discovered just after midnight on the night his mother vanished. The GPS data placed him there for nearly 40 minutes before returning home. When confronted, Tyler shrugged and claimed he'd gone out for a drive to clear his head, but when pressed on why he'd gone into the woods, his story fell apart. He said he didn't remember exactly where he'd gone, that he might have just taken a wrong turn. His words came out too quickly, like someone trying to fill the silence. That same evening, investigators searched the house again, this time with a warrant. Down in the basement, they noticed something they hadn't paid attention to before: a faint chemical smell. Near the laundry area, a folded tarp sat behind a shelf of paint cans. It looked clean at first glance, but when one officer unfolded it, he saw faint reddish stains that had been scrubbed but not completely removed. They also found a mop bucket and cleaning supplies that seemed recently used. The officers took samples for testing, though everyone in the room already suspected what they might find. The next day, forensic teams began analyzing everything. The stains on the tarp tested positive for traces of human blood, though it was too degraded to match immediately. Even without a full DNA result, it was enough to raise serious suspicion. Tyler's calm, emotionless behavior only made things worse. He didn't seem frightened, just irritated that the police were harassing him. He told anyone who would listen that his mother had probably run away to start a new life and that the police were wasting their time. Behind the scenes, the detectives were growing more certain that they were dealing with something far darker than a missing person case. They started piecing together a timeline. Every call, every movement, every witness statement, the image that emerged was troubling. Tyler had fought with his mother the night before she disappeared. Several neighbors confirmed hearing raised voices. One neighbor even mentioned seeing the faint flicker of a backyard fire later that night. When police returned to check the yard, they found an old metal barrel half filled with ash and charred debris. Among the blackened remains, they recovered fragments of fabric and melted plastic, consistent with something that might have come from a purse or a wallet. By this point, the evidence was stacking up, but one crucial piece was still missing: a body. Without it, the case could still fall apart. Investigators needed something more solid to link Tyler directly to his mother's disappearance. They decided to keep watching him, hoping he would slip up. Tyler's behavior began to unravel under the quiet pressure. He stopped answering calls from friends, barely left the house, and was seen pacing the neighborhood late at night. When officers drove by, he would stand in the window, staring out without moving. His calm had started to crack, revealing the anxiety beneath the surface. As days passed, Maplewood felt heavier, the air thick with unanswered questions. The once idyllic neighborhood had turned into a place of whispered rumors and nervous glances. Everyone knew the police were closing in, but no one dared to speak openly about it. The truth was creeping closer, hidden somewhere between what Tyler claimed and what the evidence was beginning to show. And even though the full picture wasn't yet clear, it was becoming harder to deny that whatever happened to Mrs. Hensley had started in that house and that her son knew far more than he was willing to say. The case might have slowed down if not for one unexpected discovery. While detectives were reviewing old reports, a neighbor mentioned something she had forgotten to tell them earlier. Her husband had a small wildlife camera mounted on a tree behind their property, aimed toward the wooded path that separated their yard from the Hensleys. He used it to track deer and raccoons. It wasn't something he checked often, but curiosity made him scroll through the footage around the time Mrs. Hensley disappeared. That's when he saw a blurry figure in the middle of the night, dragging something large and heavy toward the trees. When the police got hold of the footage, they gathered around a small screen in the station's evidence room. The video was grainy and faintly lit, but it was clear enough to make out movement. A lone figure crossed the frame, carrying what looked like a rolled-up rug or carpet. The person's shoulders were hunched, the movements clumsy and strained, as if they were struggling with the weight. At first, it was impossible to identify who it was. But when the light from a motion sensor briefly illuminated part of the figure, a logo on the sweatshirt became visible, an orange flame emblem that matched the one Tyler often wore in photos on his social media pages. The footage wasn't perfect, but it was enough to draw the detectives' attention back to him. They watched it again and again, pausing at every frame, studying the shape of the car parked in the background, the time stamp in the corner 11:59 p.m. It lined up almost exactly with the time his phone had pinged in the area. Everything was beginning to connect. The next morning, they brought Tyler in for questioning again. He walked into the station with the same detached expression he always wore. He sat across from the detectives, arms crossed, tapping his foot against the floor. When they played the footage for him, his body stiffened for the first time. For a few seconds, he said nothing, his eyes locked on the screen. Then he leaned back and muttered that it wasn't him, that the person in the video could have been anyone. But the calm tone was gone now, replaced with something sharper, defensive. The detectives didn't push immediately. They let the silence fill the room, watching as Tyler grew restless. Finally, he said that if he had gone out that night, it was only to take out trash from the garage, and he'd rolled up an old carpet to throw away. He said it was a coincidence that he'd done it so late. The explanation sounded flimsy, and both detectives knew it. They didn't respond, just kept taking notes, letting his own words tighten around him. Forensic teams returned to the Hensley property the same day, this time focusing on the yard. The barrel in the back still contained ash, and when sifted carefully, it revealed a few more fragments, a small piece of a button, a metal zipper pull, and something else that looked like part of a broken bracelet. Mrs. Hensley's sister later confirmed that her sister had owned a bracelet like it, one she wore almost every day. When confronted with this new evidence, Tyler's composure began to crumble. His story changed slightly each time he was questioned. At first, he claimed he didn't remember anything about the night. Then he said his mother had been angry, that they'd argued about money. Later, he added that she'd threatened to take his car away and that he'd left the house to calm down. Every version of the story contradicted the one before it. After nearly 6 hours of questioning, the pressure finally broke him. He started to talk, not out of guilt, but out of frustration. His tone shifted between anger and self-pity. He said his mother had always made his life miserable, that she'd treated him like a child even when he was an adult. He said that night she'd yelled at him for spending money she didn't have, and he'd lost control. According to his story, it wasn't supposed to happen, but when she fell and hit her head, panic took over. He admitted to dragging her body out to the woods because he didn't know what else to do. Detectives wrote down every word, careful not to interrupt. They didn't tell him that his confession matched almost perfectly with what the evidence already suggested. He said he deburned some of her belongings to make it look like she'd run away, hoping people would stop asking questions. When asked where her body was now, he looked down at the table and whispered that he didn't remember exactly where he'd left her, just somewhere near the creek. That night, police teams with dogs searched the area along the creek bed, guided by the directions he'd given. After several hours, they found what they were looking for, a shallow grave covered with branches and leaves, hidden behind a fallen log. Inside were the remains of Mrs. Hensley. The news spread through Maplewood like a shockwave. People gathered outside the Hensley home, whispering in disbelief. The same neighbors who once pitied Tyler now spoke his name with disgust. For years, they had watched the tension in that house, ignoring the signs, telling themselves it was none of their business. Now they couldn't stop wondering if something could have been done earlier. Back at the station, Tyler sat in a small holding cell, staring at the wall. He'd confessed, but not out of remorse. His face showed no emotion, no regret, only a cold emptiness that unsettled everyone who saw him. The quiet house at the end of Willow Drive was now a crime scene, and the story of the Hensleys, once the image of a normal family, had turned into something that no one in Maplewood would ever forget. The trial began 8 months after Tyler's arrest, and by then, Maplewood had changed. The Hensley house stood empty. its white fence chipped and the grass grown tall, a haunting reminder of the family that once lived there. The townspeople avoided walking past it. What had once been a picture of small-town peace had turned into a landmark of tragedy. Tyler's name was whispered everywhere in grocery store aisles, at the diner, outside the courthouse. Some people spoke of him with anger, others with disbelief, wondering how someone could do something so heartless to their own mother. When the court proceedings started, reporters lined up outside, cameras flashing as Tyler was escorted in wearing an orange jumpsuit. He looked smaller somehow, thinner and paler than the smug young man who once strutted around town. Still, his expression remained cold, his eyes empty. He showed no emotion as the charges were read aloud: second-degree murder, tampering with evidence, and abuse of a corpse. The courtroom was packed with locals, many of whom had known Mrs. Hensley personally. Her sister sat in the front row, clutching a tissue, her face pale but composed. The prosecution painted a clear and chilling picture. They described the years of growing tension in the Hensley home, the pattern of disrespect, and the escalating anger that had led to violence. They presented the physical evidence: the tarp with blood traces, the burned belongings, the bracelet found in the ashes, and the wildlife camera footage that showed Tyler dragging what appeared to be his mother's body toward the woods. Piece by piece, they built a story that was hard for anyone to ignore. The defense tried to shift the narrative. They claimed Tyler had acted in panic, that the situation had spiraled out of control after a heated argument. They spoke about his troubled childhood, the loss of his father, and his mother's strictness. They suggested that what happened was an accident fueled by years of emotional strain. But the jury didn't seem convinced. Tyler's demeanor throughout the trial didn't help him. He sat motionless most days, rarely looking up, and when he did, it was with a detached stare that unsettled even his own attorney. Witnesses took the stand one after another. Neighbors recalled the shouting on the night of the disappearance, the smell of burning from the backyard, and the sight of Tyler's car leaving the driveway around midnight. Mrs. Hensley's co-worker testified about her reliability, explaining how out of character it was for her to disappear without telling anyone. The medical examiner described the injuries found on her body, making it clear they couldn't have come from a simple fall. The evidence was overwhelming, and by the second week, it was clear which way the verdict would lean. When the prosecution played the wildlife camera footage for the jury, the room fell silent. The grainy clip flickered across the screen, showing the figure in the dark, dragging a long, heavy bundle. Even though the image wasn't crystal clear, the resemblance was undeniable. A few people in the courtroom turned away, unable to keep watching. Tyler didn't react, he just sat there, staring straight ahead as though the footage had nothing to do with him. After nearly 3 weeks of testimony and arguments, the jury went into deliberation. It took them only 5 hours to return with a decision. The foreman stood, voice steady, and announced that Tyler Hensley was guilty on all counts. A ripple of relief swept through the room. Mrs. Hensley's sister began to cry softly, holding her husband's hand. Tyler didn't move, he didn't speak, he simply stared forward, expressionless, as if the words meant nothing. When the judge pronounced the sentence life in prison without the possibility of parole, there was no visible reaction from him. The bailiffs led him out of the courtroom as cameras flashed. Outside, reporters rushed to capture every moment, their voices rising over the sound of murmuring townspeople. For Maplewood, it marked both an ending and a beginning, the closing of one of the darkest chapters in the town's history and the start of a long effort to forget. In the months that followed, the Hensley house was put up for sale, though no one wanted to buy it. The lawn grew wild, the shutters loosened, and the once welcoming porch began to rot. Children whispered stories about ghosts when they passed by on their bikes, daring each other to step onto the overgrown walkway. The golden retriever that had once barked at passers-by had been adopted by a family across town. Life in Maplewood slowly went back to normal, but something about the town's atmosphere had changed permanently. People spoke of Mrs. Hensley with warmth, remembering her kindness, her tireless work at the clinic, and her forgiving nature. Some said she had loved her son too much, had trusted him long after she shouldn't have. Others wondered how no one had seen the signs clearly enough to stop what happened. The truth lingered like a shadow. Everyone had noticed something wrong, but no one had acted until it was far too late. Years later, when people spoke of the case, it became a warning rather than just a story. It reminded parents, neighbors, and teachers to pay attention to the cracks that form quietly inside families. Tyler Hensley remained in prison, his name rarely spoken except in hushed tones. Mrs. Hensley was buried beside her husband in the town cemetery, beneath a headstone engraved with a simple phrase she used to say often, "Be kind, even when it's hard." The tragedy of Willow Drive stayed alive in memory, not because of the crime itself, but because of the lesson it left behind. Evil had not come from a stranger that night. It had grown quietly within the walls of a loving home, disguised as a son who never learned to love back.